I'm starting a new project in the wood shop today. I'm going to make myself a book tree. I found some more of that spalted wood that I have, and I'm going to try to keep some of the live edge on it. So let's see what I come up with. I had to start out on the planer as all this wood is off my sawmill. This piece here is questionable, but I'm going to try to use it as I want heavier wood for the base. But it's decayed to the point I'm not sure it's any good. After I got everything planed, I needed to rip a couple of the boards that had live edge on both edges since I only wanted live edge on one edge. So I used my homemade track saw, well, really just a saw guide, to make the cuts. And right from the start here, I'm taking what is a pretty simple build that any beginner could do and making it harder because I want to put my own spin on it using live edge wood, and I'll talk more about that later. I clamp the guide in place at both ends and start my cut. Take a little break partway through to make sure I'm not cutting in my bench. Not that it would be a great loss, but I'm clear, so I press on. But this clamp is in the way, so I have to stop again and reposition it to finish the cut. Might be a little inconvenient, but it works. I'll end up getting a real track saw at some point probably. In the meantime, this is the poor man's method that works pretty well. This board didn't have live edge on both edges, but it was crooked, so I needed to rip the edge straight on it. I also cut the end off that was split, then use the guide again to rip it. So most of what you see me doing here, I'm doing to use these specific boards. If you were starting with dimensional lumber to make one of these, you wouldn't have to do any of these steps. These boards had some more defects that I would have to address later, but right now I'm going to start cutting some to length, or at least rough length, on the miter saw. And these first ones here I'm cutting to 15 inches. Then cleaned up the square edges with a couple passes through the jointer. I cut a few pieces a little longer, around 18 inches or so, and I needed at least 10 pieces in all. I ended up with 11 usable, so I had one extra, just in case. Then it was time for sanding. I started out with 100 grit and did all sides of all 11 pieces. And that required a little extra sanding on the live edge to clean that up. I'm showing you the whole process, or most of it, on one of the 11 pieces here. And this is at 3 times normal speed. So multiply this amount of time by 3, and then again by 11. And you get some idea as to how long it took to get through the whole stack. There's one of the more interesting live edges. Anyway, I kept at it for 30 minutes or more and got through the stack. But I'm not exactly done. I switched out to 150 grit and went through the stack again. I did the pencil trick to make sure I was sanding enough, and it probably actually saved me a little time. I think I could mark it and sand the pencil marks off in less time than I was taking without the pencil marks. which I thought was a little interesting. But I worked through the stack, and I was definitely ready for a break from the vibrator for a bit by the time I got done. So I worked on a couple of the pieces that need a little massaging around some defects, like this one that had a piece of the live edge split off. I pecked away at it with my little wood shaver rasp, and then tried my pocket knife to do some whittling on it. In the end, I ended up using the 10 best pieces out of the 11, and this is the one that didn't make the cut, so to speak. So all this work was for nothing, but I didn't know it yet. And then back to sanding for the next round. 220 this time, and that should be the last time through the stack. Well, for the power sander anyway. I still needed to hand sand all the live edges, because that's the best way to get those, because they're uneven and randomly shaped. So back through the stack again, hand sanding with 220 grit. I had to use a little wire brush to get into some of the nooks and crannies on a couple of them too. Pretty cool looking live edges on a couple of these though. I cut a 45 on the bottom of the first board where it'll meet the base, and I'm going to lay these out how they'll go together. I start looking at which boards to put where, since these all kind of vary in width. I want to start out with the widest ones at the bottom and end up with the shorter and narrower boards toward the top. So I'm looking at that and how the edges match up. Since they vary, they're not going to all match up perfectly, so I'll try to get them as close as possible to minimize any trimming. So I do a lot of trying them on for size and swapping them out to come up with the best progression of boards from bottom to top. I ended up ripping a bit off of a couple of them to narrow them down so they were a closer match to the others. One thing I found out for sure while I was doing this is, for bigger projects like this, I need a bigger workbench. But in the end, I came up with a pretty decent fit up that I was happy with. I numbered all the pieces on the end so I could keep them in order and went ahead with the next step. I'm going to have to pare down these ends just a little bit so they match up. And we'll work on that. I started out taking them down with a wood shaver rasp and some coarse sandpaper. I didn't want them to look machined. I wanted them to look more natural, and this method definitely worked okay, but it proved to be a little slow. Again, this is a step you wouldn't have to do if you were using regular S4S lumber. That looks a little better. I did a couple more of them that way, but I decided to try a little faster method, taking them down initially with the belt sander. That sped up the process, and I could touch them up after with the rasp and sandpaper. So now for some assembly. Made myself a gauge block to make each one of these the same distance from the end, and that's just to keep the intersections lined up all the way up. After I got them all blended to each other fairly well, I started on putting them together, paying attention to my previously applied numbered order. I started just screwing them together, but decided I might as well add some glue to strengthen the joints as well. Suppose I should glue those. I used 3 screws per shelf, pre-drilling and countersinking the screws. So what I'm going to do is assemble each one of these T's, or each one of these branches of the book tree separately, and then put them together, because if you try to attach it over here, each shelf individually, and go on up, you won't have room to get the drill in here to drive your screws. So I'll do them separately and then attach them to the other one. And I'll still have that issue when I go to attach all of these to each other, but this lets me use my regular drills to do this part of the assembly, which saves a little time because I can have the bit and countersink chucked in one and the driver in the other. I'd line them up using the gauge block, drill for the first screw, add the glue, and then do the other 2 screws. And then just rinse and repeat until I end up with 5 of these 2 shelf assemblies in all. Now to put them all together. I use the gauge block again, which helps keep everything evenly spaced and squared to each other. For the first set, I was able to use my regular drills without interference, but for the rest, I had to get the right angle drill to have room. And this was a direct result of my design choices. If I'd used the same size shelves all the way up and put each shelf in the center of the other board, I would have had room to use the regular drills. This is no big deal really, except it just slowed me down because I've only got 1 right angle drill and I had to keep swapping out the drill bit for the driver on every shelf. I'm making my version pretty tall too, and you can make these with fewer shelves to be not quite as tall, and even a shorter version for a desktop or tabletop model if you want. Once I have the shelves together, I know how tall it's going to be, so I can lay the board I'm going to use for the upright on there to mark it for approximate length. I had to do some repairs on it too, gluing some splits along the live edges, so I left that overnight to dry. The next day it was ready to go, so after it came out of the clamps, there was more sanding. Sanding the live edges adds quite a bit of time to the project since I went through 3 grits with a power sanding and then did hand sanding as well. I didn't want to leave the top end squared off, so I cut a random curve into it. That worked out well too because I was able to cut away most of a small split at the end of the board. And then I got rid of more of it with the spinning wheel of destruction. It required a lot of smoothing out with the random orbit sander and some more hand sanding to give it kind of a driftwood look. And you can see here there are still some small splits along the edges, so I addressed those with glue and sanding over it to mix some sawdust in with it. Once I had all the edges touched up on the upright, I set that aside and started looking at making a base. I wanted a fairly substantial base because this thing is going to be kind of tall, and I want it to be stable. So I wanted to double up this thicker board I had so I would end up with something between 2.5 and 3 inches thick. The trouble is this board is almost to the point of being unusable. It had some solid wood in it, but it also had some punky wood and some that was pretty far gone. And I'm not sure the exact definition of punky, but I consider it to be somewhere in between solid and as soft and spongy as wood gets when it rots all the way. And there's definitely some of that in this board as well. I'm going to try to get enough to cut 2 pieces about 20 inches long to glue together. So off to the miter saw to make a couple of quick cuts to see what I can get. Not very good wood, but I figure I'll give it a try anyway, so I slather a mess of glue on there, and a mess it was. Then I see how many clamps I can get around the edges. I use the quick grip clamps to hold it in place first, and then use the F-style clamps. The woodworker's credo about you can never have too many clamps definitely holds true. And I definitely used enough glue. And after I got the excess off my hands, I added a few more clamps for good measure and left it set overnight. The next morning I got it out of the clamps and started working with it. I ran the backside through the joiner a few times to clean that up and make it nice and flat and square. Then it was over to the miter saw to trim off the ends. This got rid of the glue squeeze out and cleaned up the ends nice and even. Then I get out the sawdust maker, and this thing certainly is efficient at its purpose. I wanted to blend in the front and sides to give this somewhat of the driftwood look on the edges as well. On the front, I ground away some of the more soft wood and blended it so it didn't look as much like two boards glued together. I was trying to make it look more like one piece. Once I had the basic shape, I hit it with the sander to start smoothing out the rough edges left by the wood eater. I think I started with 80 grit here and worked up to 120 or 150. That rasp wheel leaves it pretty rough, so it takes working through the grits to get it down to smooth. I'm finding soft spots in this wood too, so I still have my doubts about using it, but I press on anyway. After everything is sanded down, I let the dust settle a while, and then applied some tung oil to the upright board. I decided that even though I used glue to put the shelves together, I wasn't going to use glue to attach the shelves to the back or the back to the base, so I could apply the oil before final assembly. I did the back first and just flipped it over to do the front. This is a penetrating oil that you just wipe or brush on and let soak in, and it takes a long time to dry. So I'm not worried about it sticking to the bench or anything, or even getting it on the bench, because any excess can be wiped right up tomorrow. Sure does make a difference when you put it on though. Makes that dramatic grain pattern just jump right out at you. I also did the shelves. My plan is for 1 or 2 coats of tung oil and then a top coat of hard wax oil for the final finish. Then for the base. I wanted to do the same finish on the base, but with that punky wood I decided to try stabilizing it with epoxy, which will put a nice hard coat on it and make it so the softer spots are hard and protected, but it's going to make for a different look. I was thinking maybe a thin coat, but that's hard to do with thick epoxy. So I still kind of think this isn't going to give me what I want, but I'm experimenting. I'm finally to the point of assembling this thing. I've worked on it several days over the course of a week or so, and you can probably count the days by how many times I'm wearing a different shirt. I figure I'd clamp the back to the base and then clamp the shelves to the back so I can get a good look at it. I'm mostly going to line this up by eye since the shelves are different sizes and the back has uneven live edges. Can't really use a level on that except to kind of hold up there and eyeball the rough center. It actually doesn't look too bad, so after taking a look from behind the camera, I get a level to give it a check that way. It looks kind of centered. I measure for the center of the base and put the level there and see how that lines up with what kind of looks like approximate center toward the top. Here again, I wouldn't have this issue if I'd have used regular S4S lumber. I could do everything by measure and make things even that way. But it looks pretty good, so I get the shelves to clamp those in place to see how they look on the backboard. They're a little unwieldy, but I managed to hold them up there in place until I can get a couple of clamps on. Great camera angle, eh? I'm definitely not a very good cinematographer. I break all the rules, like the one that says, never turn your back on the camera. Anyway, I get it up there and give it a check with the level, just lining the edge of the level up to the shelf intersections. I also look at where the shelf intersections line up with the backboard all the way up. With a couple minor adjustments, another quick check with the level, and another eyeball from behind the camera, I think it's good to go. Time to make it permanent and add some screws. I drill pilot holes with a countersink bit, and some 1.5" screws should do the trick. Same for the shelves. Pilot holes and screws, lined up by eye. I had enough to hold it in place securely, then move it onto the bench to do the rest of them in a little easier position. I get at least 2 screws in each shelf all the way up, and I also added another longer 2-inch screw to the base for good measure. And here it is. The finished, well, at least for now, product. So I finally got this thing done. Let me tell you a little bit about it. First off, I'm not really satisfied with the base. That wood was kind of punky and almost rotten. I made it work, and I had to seal it and stabilize it with epoxy. It doesn't really look right. It's shiny and the rest isn't, so I want it to match. So I'll probably redo that base. Overall, it's about 66 inches tall to the very top. And I made the bottom shelves. The very bottom one is 18 inches. And I recommend if you make one of these, even if you make all your shelves the same length, make that one about 1 inch longer so you can cut the 45 on the bottom. And mine, that one was 18. The next two are like 17. I think this one's 16.5 or so, and the rest are 15 inches apiece. Now, the way I did this, I wanted the bottom ones to be a little bit wider, so it's shaped more like a tree. And I used all live edge. So these vary in width. If you make one of these, it will be way easier to use just 1x8 from the local lumber yard and make them all the same. Every shelf 14 or 15 inches, center up on it, and you'd be able to clear with the drill to put them together, no problem. And it would be way less work. You could build one of these probably in a day. Because I did the live edge, I had to massage a lot of these boards, and it was a lot of sanding. So you could do one a lot easier with just S4S lumber from the lumber store. I think it came out good. I'm happy with it other than the base. And I think it'll work and be a nice addition to the office. So tell me what you think. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.